The ice beneath her feet cracked like her heart one more step and she'd fall into the abyss where rejected mates go to die. Blood dripped from the claw marks across Lyra Nightshade's ribs, each drop freezing before it hit the snow. The crimson stains looked like scattered rubies against the white wasteland, beautiful and damning all at once. Her silver eyes flickered with power she couldn't control, couldn't trust, couldn't silence no matter how hard she tried. 23 years old and already marked as cursed, broken, too dangerous for love. The blizzard howled around her like the voices of every wolf who'd ever turned their back on her. Ice crystals whipped against her face, each one a tiny blade, reminding her that nature itself seemed determined to finish what Alpha Kieran had started. Her breath came in ragged silver puffs that glowed faintly in the moonlight. Even her exhale betrayed the power that made her an outcast. She stumbled forward through snow that reached her knees, each step sinking deeper than the last. The frozen ground beneath felt as unstable as everything else in her life. Behind her, the howls were getting closer. The Shadow Moon Pack's hunters had been tracking her for hours, their voices carrying on the wind like a death sentence she couldn't outrun. Her inner wolf whimpered deep in her chest, a sound of pure anguish that had nothing to do with physical pain. "They cast us out," it whispered in the voice of every hurt she'd ever carried. "Called us cursed. Called us monster. Maybe they're right." The rejection still burned in her chest like acid, Alpha Kieran's words echoing louder than the storm. "You're too broken, too dangerous, Lyra. I choose someone stable, someone who won't accidentally burn down everything I've built." His voice had been so calm, so reasonable, as if he were discussing the weather instead of ripping her soul in half. She pressed her palm against her ribs where the claw marks bled through her torn shirt. The wounds were deep but not fatal. They'd wanted her to suffer, not die quickly. The hunters had caught up to her 3 hours ago at the old pine grove where she'd been sheltering. She'd fought back without meaning to, silver flames erupting from her hands in a desperate burst of terror and rage. The flames had been beautiful and terrible, turning the snow to steam and the air to shimmering heat. For a moment, she'd felt powerful instead of powerless. Then she saw the fear in their eyes, not respect, not awe, but the kind of terror people reserved for natural disasters and rabid animals. That look had cut deeper than any claw ever could. One of the hunters, a beta named Marcus who used to bring her honeycakes when she was small, had backed away from her like she was diseased. "Look at her," he'd whispered to his companion. "The silver fire burns cold. That's not natural. That's not wolf." She'd run then, because staying meant proving them right about the monster part. Running meant maybe, somewhere in this frozen wasteland, she could find a place where silver fire was something other than a curse. Now, hours later, her legs shook with exhaustion and her power flickered like a dying candle. Ice crystals formed around her bleeding wounds, her body's magic responding to her emotions without permission. The storm seemed to grow fiercer the more desperate she became, as if the weather was feeding off her anguish. Lightning split the sky above, illuminating the jagged ice formations that jutted up from the ground like broken teeth. This place had once been beautiful, she thought. Before the Great Freeze 30 years ago, before the old magic started dying out, this ravine had been green and alive. Now it looked like the skeleton of a world that had forgotten how to hope. She slipped on a patch of black ice and went down hard, her knees cracking against the frozen stone beneath the snow. The impact sent shockwaves of pain up her spine, but she bit back the cry that wanted to escape. Crying was weakness, and she'd been weak enough for one lifetime. When she tried to push herself up, her hands left glowing silver prints in the snow. The power was getting harder to contain, responding to every spike of fear and hurt like a wild animal sensing danger. She stared at the handprints, watching them pulse with soft light before fading away. Even her touch left evidence of what she was marked, different, wrong. The howls were closer now. She could hear individual voices, distinguishing between Marcus and his hunting partner, a cruel gamin named Seth who'd always looked at her like she was something he wanted to break. They were following her blood trail, Her scent, the strange magic signature that clung to her like perfume made of starlight and smoke. She forced herself to stand, legs trembling with cold and exhaustion. Each breath felt like swallowing knives, the freezing air cutting into her lungs. Her ribs ached where the claws had raked across them, but she couldn't afford to stop, couldn't afford to let them catch her, because she knew what happened to dangerous things that couldn't be controlled. The pack had 3 options for dealing with threats: exile, imprisonment, or elimination. She'd already been exiled. She'd already run as far as her legs could carry her. That left only one option if they caught up, and she'd seen what Marcus looked like when he made that kind of decision. He'd killed rogues before. His eyes went flat and cold, like a shark's, and he didn't hesitate. She stumbled forward through the storm, her silver eyes scanning the darkness for somewhere to hide. The ice formations around her grew taller and more twisted, creating a maze of frozen spires that reflected the moonlight in fractured patterns. It was beautiful in a deadly way, like everything else in her life. Her foot caught on something buried in the snow and she pitched forward, catching herself against what looked like a stone wall. But when she pressed her palm against the surface, she realized it wasn't natural rock. The stone was carved with symbols that seemed to shift and dance in her peripheral vision, ancient markings that made her skin prickle with recognition she couldn't explain. The symbols weren't random scratches or decorative patterns. They were words, she realized, written in a language that predated the modern packs by centuries. Her fingers traced the carved lines, and for a moment the silver fire in her chest burned warmer instead of cold. The stone felt familiar under her touch, like coming home to a place she'd never been. "What are you?" she whispered to the ancient marker, her voice barely audible over the wind. The stone didn't answer, but the symbols seemed to glow faintly where she touched them. For the first time since the rejection, since the exile, since the endless running through frozen wilderness, she felt something other than despair. Not hope exactly, but possibility. Like maybe she wasn't the only one who'd ever carried silver fire in her blood. The howls behind her had gone quiet. That should have been a relief, but every survival instinct she possessed screamed that silence was worse than pursuit. Predators went quiet when they were preparing to strike, when they'd cornered their prey and no longer needed to track by sound. She pressed her back against the carved stone and tried to control her breathing, tried to dim the silver glow that seemed to emanate from her skin. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. Each beat sent fresh waves of pain through her wounded side, but she forced herself to stay still. Moving now would give away her position. Moving now might be the last mistake she ever made. The wind died to a whisper, and in that sudden quiet, she heard something that made her blood freeze solid in her veins. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching through the snow with the patience of something that knew its prey had nowhere left to run. "Lyra." Marcus's voice drifted through the ice. Formations, conversational and almost gentle. "Come out, little flame. We're not here to hurt you." The lie was so smooth she might have believed it if she hadn't seen the silver-tipped arrows in Seth's quiver. Arrows designed specifically for creatures with magic in their blood. Arrows that would burn through her power like acid through paper. They hadn't brought those arrows to talk. "Your alpha is worried about you," Seth called out, his voice coming from a different direction. They were trying to surround her, she realized, boxing her in against the stone wall like a rabbit in a trap. "He sent us to bring you home safely." Another lie. Kieran had made his feelings about her abundantly clear when he'd chosen his new mate in front of the entire pack. Scarlet Redwood, with her perfect auburn hair and stable, predictable magic that made flowers bloom instead of forests burn. Scarlet, who would never accidentally melt the ice sculpture at the pack's winter celebration or leave glowing handprints on everything she touched. Lyra pressed her palms flat against the carved stone behind her and felt the ancient symbols pulse with warmth. The power in her chest responded, silver flames flickering along her collarbone like a necklace made of starfire. She was tired of running, tired of being afraid of what she was, tired of letting other people's fear define her worth. "I know why you're here," she called back, her voice carrying across the frozen wasteland with surprising strength. "The silver arrows give you away. Silence." Then Seth's laugh, sharp and cruel as breaking glass. "Smart girl. Always were too smart for your own good. Orders are orders, Lyra," Marcus added, and she could hear the regret in his voice. Real regret, which somehow made it worse. "You know we can't let someone like you roam free. Too much risk." "Someone like you." The words hit like physical blows, each syllable a confirmation of every fear she'd carried since childhood. Too dangerous, too powerful, too different to be allowed to exist in their carefully controlled world. The silver fire in her chest flared hotter, responding to the anger that was finally stronger than the fear. Ice crystals formed in the air around her, dancing in complex patterns that looked almost like writing. The carved stone at her back grew warm, the ancient symbols glowing brighter as her power touched them. For the first time in her life, the magic didn't feel like a curse. It felt like recognition, like the stone was welcoming her home. She stepped away from the wall and let the silver flames crown her head like a diadem made of moonlight and fury. The light reflected off the ice formations around her, turning the frozen wasteland into a cathedral of crystal and fire. She was done hiding, done apologizing for taking up space in a world that had never wanted her anyway. "Come and take me then," she said, her voice carrying the promise of burning. The footsteps stopped. In the sudden silence, she heard Seth curse under his breath and the soft whistle of arrows being knocked to bowstrings. They were going to try to take her down from a distance, she realized. Smart. Getting too close to someone whose emotions could melt steel was a good way to end up as a cautionary tale. But as she stood there in her crown of silver fire, surrounded by ancient stones that hummed with recognition, she heard something else. Something that made her heart skip in a way that had nothing to do with fear. A shadow moved between the ice formations, too large to be human, too quiet to be a regular wolf. The shape was wrong for Marcus or Seth, wrong for any of the Shadow Moon pack hunters she knew were closing in on her position. This was something else entirely. Her silver eyes tracked the movement as it flowed between the frozen spires like smoke given form. Not approaching directly, not fleeing, just observing, waiting. The predator instincts that came with her wolf heritage told her she should be terrified. This new presence radiated power that made her own silver fire feel like a candle next to a bonfire. But instead of fear, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Curiosity, hope, the desperate, irrational belief that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone in this frozen wasteland as she'd thought. The shadow paused behind a particularly tall ice formation, just visible enough for her to make out the general shape. Tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the kind of fluid grace that spoke of deadly competence. Not pack, her instincts whispered. Not hunter, something else entirely. "I wasn't alone in this frozen wasteland," she whispered to herself, silver flames dancing around her fingertips like liquid starlight. "And I wasn't sure if that was salvation or doom." The wind picked up again, howling through the ice formations with renewed fury. The storm was getting worse, she realized, but not naturally. The weather was responding to the convergence of power in this place, her silver fire, the ancient magic humming in the carved stones, and whatever dangerous presence watched her from the shadows. Marcus shouted something to Seth, but the wind snatched his words away before she could make them out. She saw movement in her peripheral vision as the hunters tried to reposition themselves, but her attention remained fixed on the shadow that had gone perfectly still behind the ice, waiting, watching, deciding whether she was worth the risk. If you're drawn to tales of the rejected finding their true power, hit subscribe to Werewolf Shifter Romance Tales, because every outcast deserves their moment to shine. Trust me, you'll want to know what happens when the shadow steps into the light. Now, back to Lyra's story. The silver fire around her hands pulsed brighter as her heart rate spiked. Whatever happened next would change everything. She could feel it in her bones, in the way the ancient stones hummed with anticipation, in the charged air that tasted of ozone and possibilities. She was done running, done being afraid, done letting other people decide her worth based on their fears. Let them come, hunters, shadows, whatever else this frozen wasteland wanted to throw at her. She was Lyra Nightshade, carrier of the silver flame, and she was finally ready to burn bright enough to light her own way forward, even if it meant burning down everything behind her. Lyra Nightshade, the voice cut through the storm like a blade. Through silk, deep and rough-edged with something that sounded almost like pain. She spun toward the sound, silver flames flaring around her hands in defensive arcs that cast dancing shadows across the ice. The shadow stepped out from behind the frozen spire, and her breath caught in her throat. He was tall, broader than Marcus or Seth, moving with the kind of lethal grace that belonged to predators who'd learned to kill quietly. But there was something wrong with the way he held himself, careful, controlled, like someone who'd been broken and rebuilt from sharper pieces. His eyes were amber, wolf gold and ancient, studying her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. Scars carved pale lines across the left side of his face, running from his temple down to his jaw like someone had tried to erase him and given up halfway through. Dark hair fell across his forehead, longer than pack regulation, wild from the storm and streaked with premature silver at the temples. But it was the scars across his throat that made her silver fire flicker with something other than fear. 4 parallel lines, deliberate and cruel, the kind of marks that came from claws meant to silence permanently. Someone had tried to rip his voice away and nearly succeeded. "How do you know my name?" Her voice came out shakier than she'd intended, the silver flames around her hands pulsing with her heartbeat. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, nostrils flaring as he scented the air around her. His expression shifted: surprise, recognition, something deeper that looked almost like hunger. Not the predatory kind that made her want to run, but the desperate hunger of someone who'd been starving for something they couldn't name. "You're bleeding silver," he said finally, his voice carrying the rough rasp of vocal cords that had been damaged and healed imperfectly. "That's interesting." The tone was unreadable, neither threat nor comfort. He stood perfectly still, about 10 feet away, hands visible but ready, like someone who'd learned that sudden movements got people killed. The distance felt calculated, close enough to help, far enough to run if her power proved as dangerous as her reputation suggested. Behind him, she could hear Marcus and Seth moving through the ice formations, their voices growing louder as they closed in. But this stranger, Zane, somehow she knew his name was Zane, though he hadn't said it, seemed unconcerned with the hunters bearing down on them. His focus remained fixed on her with laser intensity. "Stay back," she warned, taking a step backward until her shoulders hit the carved stone again. "I can't control it when I'm hurt." Something shifted in his amber eyes, a flicker of understanding that cut through her defensive walls like they were made of paper. He'd heard those words before, she realized. From his own lips, probably, in his own moments of desperate isolation. "I know what it's like to be feared," he said quietly, and started shrugging out of his jacket. The movement was slow, deliberate, giving her time to object or bolt if his proximity became too much. The jacket was black leather, worn soft from years of use, and it smelled like pine forests and winter nights, and something uniquely male that made her inner wolf stretch and purr despite every rational thought screaming at her to run. He held it out toward her, but didn't approach, didn't invade her space or try to force comfort on someone who'd been taught that acceptance always came with conditions. "You don't know anything about me," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. The silver fire around her hands dimmed slightly, responding to the strange calm that seemed to radiate from him. "I know you've been running for 3 days straight," he replied, amber eyes never leaving her face. "I know you haven't eaten since you left pack territory. I know those hunters behind us aren't here for a friendly chat." Her stomach clenched with hunger she'd been ignoring, and the admission in his voice made something tight in her chest loosen fractionally. He'd been watching her, following her, but not like a predator stalking prey, like someone keeping vigil over something precious. "You've been tracking me." It wasn't a question. "For 3 days, he confirmed, and took a single step closer, still outside her immediate striking range. but close enough that she could see the golden flecks in his amber eyes. Not to hunt. To understand. Understand what? The howls behind them grew louder. Marcus was calling her name now, his voice carrying false patience that wouldn't last much longer. Seth had gone quiet, which meant he was probably circling around to flank them. They had maybe minutes before this conversation became academic. Zane's scarred features hardened as he heard the approaching hunters. "They're going to try to kill you," he said matter-of-factly. "Silver arrows, aimed for center mass." Seth's got a good eye, but he gets impatient under pressure. The casual knowledge in his voice sent ice through her veins that had nothing to do with the storm. "How do you? Because I've run from hunters before." His hand moved to the scars across his throat, fingers tracing the old wounds with absent familiarity. "Different pack, same ending. They broke my voice, but not my will. Called me Omega after that, like damaged goods lose their worth automatically." The bitterness in his voice resonated in her chest like a struck bell. She knew that tone, knew the weight of being reduced to your most broken parts and told that was all you'd ever be. "But you're not," she said, and immediately wondered why she was defending a stranger. Something dangerous flashed in his amber eyes. "No, I'm not. Killed 3 alphas who thought being Omega made me weak. Turns out broken things develop sharp edges." The confession should have terrified her. Instead, it sent heat through her blood that had nothing to do with her silver fire. Here was someone who'd been cast out, marked as defective, and had chosen to become something that made his enemies regret their assumptions. "Your silver flame," he continued, taking another careful step closer. "I've seen it in my dreams, every night for weeks now, burning cold and bright in a place that looks exactly like this." Her breath hitched. The silver fire around her hands pulls stronger, responding to his proximity in ways that defied every rule she'd learned about her power. It was supposed to be wild, uncontrollable, dangerous to anyone who got too close. But around him, it felt curious, like it recognized something familiar. "That's impossible," she whispered. "A lot of impossible things happen when you stop trying to fit into boxes other people built for you." His amber eyes held hers steadily. "Why would you help someone like me?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Behind them, she could hear Seth's boots crunching through snow, moving in a wide arc to cut off their escape route. Marcus was still calling her name, his patience finally fraying around the edges. "Because someone like you helped make me who I am," Zane said quietly. "Even if you don't remember." The words hit her like a physical blow. Memory fragments flickered at the edges of her consciousness, a child's terrified scream, silver fire erupting in desperate protection, the scent of burned flesh and the weight of taking a life to save others. But the details remained frustratingly vague, lost in the haze of trauma and years of trying to forget. "I don't understand." "You will." He extended the jacket again, a gesture of trust that felt monumental in its simplicity. "But first, we need to get you somewhere safe." The silver fire around her hands flared as Marcus's voice grew closer. "There is nowhere safe for someone like me. There is now." The certainty in his voice made her chest tight with something that might have been hope if she'd still believed in such things. She stared at the offered jacket, at his scarred hands holding it steady despite the hunters closing in around them. Every instinct screamed that trusting anyone was dangerous. That people who offered help always wanted something in return. That broken things like her didn't deserve salvation. But when she looked into his amber eyes, she saw her own isolation reflected back and something else. Recognition. Understanding. The bone-deep knowledge of what it felt like to be cast out for the crime of being inconvenient. She reached for the jacket. The moment their fingers brushed, silver sparks literally flew. Not the painful burn of her power lashing out in fear, but something warm and bright that danced between their skin like fireflies made of starlight. The contact sent electricity up her arm and straight to her heart, which started beating in a rhythm that matched his. "Wrong," her logical mind whispered. This was all wrong. Omega males didn't make alpha females feel safe. Strangers didn't appear in frozen wastelands with perfect timing and dream prophecies. And her power definitely didn't respond to anyone's touch with curiosity instead of destruction. But Wrong had never felt so much like coming home. He wrapped the jacket around her shoulders, his hands careful not to linger but impossibly gentle. The leather held his warmth and scent, wrapping around her like protection she'd forgotten she deserved. "Who are you?" she breathed. "Zane Ashworth," he said, amber eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her forget the cold, the hunters, the silver fire still dancing around them both. "And I've been looking for you my whole life." The words hung between them like a promise and a confession rolled into one, but before Lyra could process what Zane meant, the past crashed over her in waves she couldn't stop. 6 months earlier, the Shadow Moon Pack's grand hall had been draped in midnight blue silk and silver chains, every surface polished to mirror brightness for Alpha Kieran's choosing ceremony. The scent of pine boughs and winter roses had filled the air, masking the underlying tension that came with pack politics and bloodline negotiations. She'd stood in the center of it all, wearing the traditional white dress of an unmated female. Silver flames dancing nervously around her fingertips despite the moon thistle herbs she'd choked down that morning. The herbs never worked completely, just dulled the edges of her power until it felt like trying to breathe through wet cloth. Kieran had been magnificent that night, tall, broad-shouldered, his dark hair gleaming under the ceremonial torches. The perfect alpha male, born to lead, destined to choose a mate who would strengthen his bloodline and his pack's standing. She'd known, somewhere deep in her chest, that she wasn't what he needed. But hope was a stubborn thing, and she'd let herself believe that love might be stronger than politics. Alpha Kieran Blackwood, his voice had carried across the silent hall like a death knell, reject you, Lyra Nightshade, as my mate and exile you from this pack. The words had hit her like physical blows, each syllable driving her to her knees on the polished floor. Around her, pack members averted their eyes, some in shame, others in relief that the dangerous element was finally being removed. She'd heard someone spit, the sound wet and disgusting in the sudden silence. "Your bloodline is cursed," Kieran had continued, his voice steady and reasonable, as if he were discussing weather patterns instead of destroying her life. "The silver flame destroys everything it touches. I won't risk my pack for sentiment." The silver fire had erupted then, uncontrolled and desperate, melting the ceremonial chains around her neck and scorching the floor beneath her knees. The pack had recoiled as one, fear replacing pity in their faces, and she'd known with crystal clarity that she would never belong anywhere again. Standing here in the frozen wasteland with Zane's jacket wrapped around her shoulders, the memory felt like reopened wounds. But there was something else now, a flicker of recognition that made her stomach clench with terrible understanding. "You were there," she whispered, amber eyes searching his scarred face. "The night they cast me out." Zane's expression went carefully blank, but she caught the flash of pain that crossed his features before he could hide it. I remember now." The pieces fell together with sickening clarity. "You were in the shadows by the east wall, watching. I wanted to follow you then," he admitted, his damaged voice rough with old regret. "But I was bound by my own exile. Couldn't leave pack territory without breaking the terms of my arrangement." The careful way he said arrangement told her there was more to that story, but the hunters were getting closer and she was drowning in memories she'd spent months trying to bury, the Nightflame bloodline. Even the name felt like poison on her tongue now. 200 years ago, her ancestors had been the most powerful wolves in existence, not just shifters, but wielders of silver fire that could burn through magical barriers, pack bonds, even souls themselves. Too powerful, the other bloodlines had whispered. Too dangerous to be allowed to continue. They'd been hunted to extinction, or so everyone believed. Her great-great-grandmother had survived by hiding, by marrying into lesser bloodlines and diluting the power until it was supposedly bred out completely. For generations, the Nightshade line had produced ordinary wolves with unremarkable abilities, until Lyra. The power had manifested when she was 8 years old, during the pack's summer solstice celebration. She'd been playing with the other children near the sacred grove when Tommy Redwood Scarlet's younger brother had pushed her into the ceremonial fire pit. The flames had licked at her dress, and she'd screamed in terror. The silver fire had answered. It had erupted from her small hands like liquid starlight, cold and beautiful and absolutely destructive. The sacred grove, 300-year-old oak trees blessed by generations of pack shamans, had been reduced to ash in minutes. Tommy had escaped with minor burns, but the spiritual heart of the Shadow Moon pack had been gone forever. Even her own mother couldn't look at her after that. "I tried so hard to be normal," she whispered, more to herself than to Zane. The silver fire around her hands flickered weaker, responding to the pain in her voice. 13 years of moon thistle herbs. 13 years of being their weapon when they needed me and their shame when they didn't. The herbs had been a special torture, bitter tea that made her stomach cramp and her power feel like it was trying to claw its way out of her skin. But it was better than the alternative, better than losing control and hurting someone else. Her first shift had been the final nail in her coffin. While other young wolves emerged from their transformation with normal brown or gray or black fur, hers had been silver white with tips that literally glowed in moonlight. Even in wolf form, she was marked as different, dangerous, wrong. "They never let me forget what I was," she continued, the words spilling out like blood from a reopened wound. "The pack's monster, useful for dealing with rogue threats or magical barriers, but never family, never safe to love." Something in her chest cracked as she said it, a wound she'd carried for so long it felt like part of her skeleton. Maybe they were right. Maybe she was too dangerous to love, too broken to deserve the kind of belonging she'd watched other wolves take for granted. "They made you into exactly what they feared," Zane said quietly, and there was steel in his damaged voice. "We're both the monsters they created by trying to break us." The understanding in his amber eyes hit her like a physical force. Here was someone who knew what it felt like to be reduced to your most dangerous parts, to have your worth measured only by how useful your damage could be to others. For the first time in months, her inner wolf stopped cowering. The constant ache in her chest, the bone-deep loneliness that had become her default state, eased fractionally as she looked at him. Not because he was fixing anything, but because he saw the broken pieces and wasn't running away, wasn't trying to convince her she was wrong about her own experiences, or that positive thinking would somehow heal wounds that had been festering for years. "Something about you," she started, then stopped, unsure how to put the feeling into words. "I know," he said simply. "I feel it too." The silver flames in her palms burned steadier when he was near, she realized. Warmer instead of cold. Controlled instead of wild. Like her power recognized something in him that quieted its desperate need to protect and destroy. Marcus's voice cut through her reflection like a blade. "Lyra, we know you're here. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." The spell between them shattered, reality crashing back with the force of an avalanche. The hunters had found them. The conversation was over. But as Zane moved to put himself between her and the approaching threat, his scarred hand briefly touched hers. The contact sent silver sparks dancing between their fingers again, warm and bright and utterly impossible. "Stay close to me," he murmured, amber eyes holding hers with fierce intensity. "Whatever happens, don't let them separate us." She nodded, because speaking was suddenly beyond her. The broken Omega who'd appeared from her dreams was asking her to trust him with her life, and every rational thought told her it was insane, but rationality had never gotten her anywhere except alone and bleeding in the snow. Maybe it was time to try something different. Maybe it was time to see what happened when two broken things chose to be dangerous together. The silver fire erupted around them both as Marcus and Seth closed in, but this time it wasn't wild or desperate. It moved with purpose, creating a barrier of cold flame that made the hunters stumble backward with curses that turned the air blue. "This way," Zane commanded, his scarred hand finding hers with unerring accuracy. The moment their skin touched, the silver fire responded, not calming, but focusing, like a weapon finally finding its proper grip. They ran through the ice formations as arrows whistled past their heads, silver-tipped death that sparked against stone and shattered into frozen fragments. But Zane moved like he knew this place, leading her through passages between the crystal spires that she would have missed in daylight, let alone in a blizzard. Behind them, the hunters' voices grew fainter, confused by the maze of ice and the lingering traces of silver fire that obscured their scent trail. But Lyra knew it was temporary. Marcus was persistent, and Seth was cruel enough to track them until his arrows found their mark. "Where are we going?" she gasped, her breath forming silver clouds in the freezing air. "Somewhere they can't follow," Zane replied, and she heard something in his voice, reverence, maybe, or fear. "Somewhere I've been dreaming about for weeks." The ice formations began to thin as they climbed higher into the mountains, giving way to ancient trees that shouldn't have been able to grow in this climate. Pine and oak and something else, something that made her skin prickle with recognition. The forest felt old in a way that had nothing to do with the age of the trees, old like secrets, like power that had been sleeping for centuries. Glowing mushrooms began to appear along the path, their soft blue-white light creating stepping stones through the darkness. Not natural bioluminescence, but something deeper, something that responded to their presence by brightening as they passed. "The forest is guiding us," she whispered, and felt foolish for saying it until she saw Zane nod grimly. "It's been calling to me in dreams. Every night for a month, the same path, the same destination." His amber eyes reflected the mushroom light. As he glanced back at her, "I thought I was losing my mind until I caught your scent 3 days ago." The mist around them swirled in patterns that definitely weren't natural, forming shapes that looked almost like symbols before dissolving back into vapor. The air itself hummed with energy that made her teeth ache and her silver fire dance in response. They climbed for what felt like hours, but couldn't have been more than minutes, time moving strangely in this place where normal rules seemed suspended. The trees grew larger and more ancient as they ascended, their bark carved with the same symbols she'd seen on the stone in the ice field. Then the forest opened into a clearing, and Lyra's breath stopped in her throat. 7 stone pillars rose from the earth in a perfect circle, each one easily 20 feet tall and covered in silver runes that pulsed with their own internal light. The symbols weren't carved into the stone, they were part of it, like the rock itself had been grown. Rather than shaped. At the center of the circle sat a black obsidian altar, its surface so perfectly polished it looked like liquid darkness. But when Lyra stepped closer, she realized it wasn't reflecting the mushroom light or the glow from the runes. It was reflecting something else entirely. "That's not our reflection," she breathed, staring at the altar's surface, where their physical forms should have been. The obsidian showed something deeper, the shapes of their souls, maybe, or their true selves stripped of flesh and pretense. Her reflection burned with silver fire that formed wings of light across her shoulders. Zane's was wreathed in shadows that moved like living things, protective and deadly. "My dreams led me here," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd been fighting visions he couldn't understand. "Every night for a month, the same journey, the same destination. I thought it was madness." The silver flame in her chest pulsed in rhythm with the stone pillars, each beat sending warmth through her body despite the mountain cold. This place knew her, she realized, recognized her in a way that felt like coming home to a house she'd never seen but always remembered. "What is this place?" "Moonfall Sanctuary," Zane answered, though she hadn't expected him to know. "One of the old sacred sites, from before the packs fractured into separate territories. Before politics replaced pack bonds." The runes on the pillars grew brighter as she approached the altar, silver light dancing across the ancient stone like living calligraphy. Her fingertips tingled with the need to touch, to connect, to understand why this place felt more familiar than her own childhood bedroom. "Lyra," Zane's voice carried a warning note. "Be careful. Old magic doesn't always distinguish between friend and enemy." But her hand was already reaching toward the obsidian surface, drawn by instinct older than conscious thought. The moment her palm made contact with the altar, the world exploded in silver light. The vision hit her like a physical blow, carrying her consciousness away from her body and into something vast and ancient and terrifyingly beautiful. She stood in a great hall that burned with silver fire, facing a woman who looked like her reflection aged into power and wisdom. Daughter of flame and shadow, the woman's voice resonated through dimensions, carrying the weight of prophecy and destiny. You have finally come home, Luna Nightflame. Even without introduction, Lyra knew her ancestor's name, felt the blood connection singing in her veins like recognition. The last great Alpha Queen, the one whose death had shattered the wolf realm into 7 fractured packs that had been fighting each other ever since. I don't understand, Lyra whispered into the vision. I'm nothing. I'm broken. I was cast out, as was I once. Luna's smile held centuries of sorrow and hard-won wisdom. The great sundering began when they grew afraid of what we represented: unity through strength rather than control through fear. They destroyed our bloodline to prevent this moment. The vision shifted, showing her glimpses of the past: the Nightflame wolves ruling with fire and compassion, the other bloodlines growing jealous and afraid, the conspiracy that had led to genocide disguised as necessity. But some survived, Luna continued, silver fire dancing around her form like a living crown, hiding, diminishing, waiting for the darkness to grow strong enough that the world would need us again. What darkness? But even as Lyra asked, she felt it: a presence at the edge of the vision, ancient and hungry and absolutely malevolent. The Shadow King stirs. Luna's voice grew grave. He who feeds on division, on hatred between packs, on the death of old bonds. He grows stronger as the wolf realm tears itself apart. The woman gestured, and the vision expanded to show the current state of the 7 major packs: Shadowmoon, Bloodfang, Ironwood, Stormwind, Redclaw, Nightfall, and Silvermere. All isolated, all suspicious, all so focused on their ancient grudges that they couldn't see the creeping darkness that fed on their divisions. She will unite the scattered, Luna's voice took on the cadence of prophecy, or watch the wolf realm burn in eternal night. The choice is hers, but the time is now. Silver fire erupted around Lyra in the vision, not the cold flame she'd always known, but something warm and protective and infinitely powerful. On her collarbone, a mark appeared: a silver crescent moon that glowed like captured starfire. But I can't unite anyone, Lyra protested, feeling the weight of destiny settling on her shoulders like chains. I couldn't even keep one pack from casting me out. How can I lead 7? Because you know what it feels like to be rejected, Luna replied simply. Because you understand that strength and gentleness aren't opposites. Because you've been broken and chose healing over revenge. The vision began to fade, but Luna's final words burned themselves into Lyra's consciousness. The broken one shall guard the flame until she burns bright enough to lead. Trust him, daughter. Trust yourself. The wolf realm depends on it. Lyra gasped back into her own body, her hand still pressed against the obsidian altar. The silver crescent moon on her collarbone burned with visible light, marking her as something other than what she'd been moments before. Zane was beside her instantly, his amber eyes wide with awe and something that might have been fear. The mark, he breathed. I've seen it in my dreams. You're her. You're really her. Her what? But even as she asked, she knew. The prophecy child. The heir to Luna Nightflame's power. The one who was supposed to save a world that had never wanted her in the first place. How can I unite anyone when I can't even control my own power? The question burst out of her, raw with doubt and terror. Silver flames danced permanently around her fingertips now, responding to her emotions with new intensity. Prophecies don't choose the perfect, Zane said quietly, his scarred hand covering hers where it still rested on the altar. They choose the necessary. The truth of it hit her like a physical blow. Not the perfect leader, polished and political and safe. The necessary one, broken enough to understand pain, strong enough to survive it, desperate enough to fight for a world that had given her every reason to turn her back. Around them, the ancient sanctuary pulsed with awakened power. The 7 stone pillars hummed in harmony, their runes brightening as if responding to her acceptance of what she was meant to become. Old magic stirred, connections long severed beginning to reweave themselves. But beneath the wonder and terror of destiny fulfilled, darkness pressed at the edges of her consciousness. The Shadow King, ancient and patient and infinitely cruel. The sacred sites dying as wolves abandoned the old ways. Strange disappearances, shadow creatures, dead zones spreading across the realm like infection. The wolf world was tearing itself apart, just as it had 200 years ago. History repeating itself with deadly precision. What if I'm not strong enough? She whispered, staring at the silver mark that branded her as something beyond her understanding. What if I destroy everything instead of saving it? Zane's grip on her hand tightened, anchor and promise wrapped in scarred skin. Then we burn it all down and build something better from the ashes. The fierce certainty in his voice sent heat through her blood that had nothing to do with magic. Here was someone who'd been broken by the system too, who understood that sometimes destruction was the only path to healing. The broken one shall guard the flame, she repeated Luna's words, finally understanding. That's you, isn't it? That's why you've been dreaming of this place. I've been waiting for you my whole life, he confirmed, amber eyes holding hers with devastating honesty. Even when I didn't know what I was waiting for, the destiny settled around them both like invisible chains and liberation simultaneously. Two broken things, marked by prophecy, standing at the center of power that could remake or destroy the world. The choice was theirs. Unite the scattered packs or watch everything burn. Looking at Zane's scarred face, at the fierce loyalty in his amber eyes, at the way he'd chosen her over safety again and again, Lyra felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Maybe, just maybe, broken things could be exactly what the world needed to heal. The moment of sacred revelation shattered like glass against stone. Found the cursed bitch. And she's infected an Omega with her madness. Scarlet Redwood's voice cut through the ancient sanctuary like a blade through silk, her auburn hair whipping in the wind as she led 8 elite hunters into the sacred circle. The beta's green eyes glowed with malicious satisfaction as she took in the scene. Lyra with the silver crescent mark blazing on her collarbone, Zane standing protectively beside her. Both of them caught in the act of awakening something the pack system had tried to destroy. Behind Scarlet came the hunters Lyra recognized from years of being their reluctant weapon. Marcus with his silver-tipped arrows already knocked, Seth, grinning like a wolf who'd cornered wounded prey, and 6 others whose faces blurred together in a wall of hostile intent. All of them armed, all of them trained, all of them convinced they were saving the world by putting down a monster. Look at the mighty Nightflame heir, Scarlet continued, her voice dripping with venom as she gestured toward Lyra. Bleeding in the dirt where she belongs, playing with ancient magic she's too broken to understand. The words hit harder than any physical blow. This was Alpha Kieran's chosen mate, the woman who'd taken Lyra's place in every way that mattered. Perfect, stable, politically advantageous Scarlet, who'd never accidentally burned down a sacred grove or frightened children with power she couldn't control. The prophecy was wrong, Scarlet announced to her followers, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd never doubted her own worth. She's not a savior. She's a weapon that needs to be put down before she destroys everything else. Zane moved before Lyra could process the threat, placing himself between her and the hunters with fluid grace that spoke of countless battles fought and survived. His scarred hands shifted into claws, and the shadows around him seemed to thicken and move with predatory intent. 8 against 2, he said conversationally, amber eyes scanning the circle of enemies with the calm assessment of someone who'd faced worse odds and lived. Hardly seems fair. For you, Seth laughed, the sound harsh and grating in the sacred space. The broken Omega thinks he's a hero. How touching. But there was wariness in the hunter's eyes as he studied Zane, recognition of something dangerous. That didn't match the Omega classification. The scars across Zane's throat weren't just marks of someone who'd been silenced, they were proof of someone who'd survived an attempt at execution and learned to fight twice as hard afterward. By ancient right, Scarlet declared, pulling herself up to her full height with the authority of someone born to command. We claim her as a rogue threat to all pack kind. The bloodline dies here tonight, as it should have to centuries ago. The casual way she spoke of genocide made Lyra's silver fire flare uncontrollably. Power surged through her veins like liquid lightning, but it kept fluctuating, one moment burning cold enough to crack stone, the next barely flickering around her fingertips. The emotional whiplash of prophecy, hope, and now mortal danger was making her magic unstable in ways that terrified her. You don't understand what you're doing, she said, trying to keep her voice steady as silver flames danced around her hands. There's darkness coming. The Shadow King, more fairy tales. Scarlet cut her off with dismissive cruelty. The only darkness here is what you bring with you. Chaos, destruction, death, just like your cursed bloodline always has. The attack came without warning. Marcus released his arrow in a silver streak aimed directly at Lyra's heart, but Zane was already moving. The Omega's speed was inhuman, born of desperation and years of fighting for survival against opponents who underestimated him. He caught the arrow barehanded, silver burning his palm as he crushed it to splinters. The pain should have crippled him. Instead, it seemed to fuel something dark and dangerous in his amber eyes. Mistake, he growled, and launched himself at Marcus with berserker fury. The sacred circle erupted into chaos. Zane fought like someone who'd learned that mercy was a luxury he couldn't afford, using speed and cunning to compensate for being outnumbered 4-1. He moved between the hunters like smoke given lethal form, striking at vulnerabilities they didn't know they had, using their own strength against them. Seth tried to flank him and found himself thrown against one of the ancient stone pillars hard enough to crack ribs. Marcus attempted to reload and discovered his bowstring had been cut by claws that moved faster than his eyes could follow. The others circled warily, suddenly realizing that the broken Omega was anything but helpless. But while Zane held off the majority of the hunters, Scarlet had her own target. Time to end this charade, the beta snarled, silver claws extending as she stalked toward Lyra. No more prophecies. No more ancient bloodlines. Just a quick death for a problem that should have been solved years ago. Lyra's power surged in response to the direct threat, silver fire erupting around her in defensive arcs that turned the night air into shimmering heat. But the flames kept shifting between scorching and cool, responding to her emotional state in ways she couldn't predict or control. Scarlet smiled at the display of unstable magic. Can't even control your own power. How did you think you were going to save anyone? The words hit like physical blows, confirming every fear Lyra had carried since childhood. Maybe they were right. Maybe she was too broken, too dangerous, too unstable to be anything other than a weapon pointed at innocent people. The doubt made her power flicker and fail at exactly the wrong moment. Scarlet's claws raked across Lyra's face in 4 parallel lines that mirrored the scars on Zane's throat. The pain was immediate and shocking, warm blood flowing down her cheek as she stumbled backward. But worse than the physical wound was the symbolism, another mark of being broken, another scar to remind her that she didn't belong anywhere. There, Scarlet said with satisfaction, examining her bloody claws. Now you look like what you really are. Rage exploded through Lyra's chest like molten silver, burning away doubt and fear and leaving only pure, focused fury. The power that had been fluctuating suddenly stabilized, burning cold and bright and absolutely controlled for the first time in her life. Silver flames erupted outward in a nova of cold fire that cracked the ancient stones and sent the hunters scrambling for cover. The blast was precise, surgical, avoiding Zane while engulfing everything else in a wave of power that turned snow to steam and made the very air shimmer with heat. When the light faded, Scarlet was on her knees, her perfect auburn hair singed and her green eyes wide with the kind of terror Lyra had become accustomed to inspiring. Around the circle, the hunters had been thrown back by the shockwave, their confidence replaced by the dawning realization that they might have bitten off more than they could chew. You want to see what the Nightflame bloodline can do? Lyra asked, silver fire dancing around her like a living crown. Let me show you why your ancestors were so afraid of us. But before she could unleash the full extent of her awakened power, a new voice cut through the chaos. Enough! Alpha Kieran Blackwood stepped into the sacred circle like he owned it, his dark presence commanding attention even in the midst of battle. He was exactly as Lyra remembered, tall, powerful, radiating the kind of natural authority that made other wolves automatically defer. Behind him came reinforcements, another 6 hunters that brought their numbers to overwhelming odds. His ice blue eyes took in the scene with calculated assessment, his mate kneeling in the snow with singed hair, his hunters scattered and wary, the ancient sanctuary crackling with awakened power that made the hair on his arms stand on end. Zane Ashworth, he said conversationally, as if they were discussing weather instead of warfare. I remember you, cast out of the Bloodfang territory, for challenging their alpha's authority. Broken voice, Omega classification, no pack to claim you. Zane had gone perfectly still at the sound of his full name. Amber eyes locked on Kieran with the focus of a predator deciding whether to fight or flee. Blood trickled from cuts across his knuckles where silver arrows had grazed him, but he showed no sign of backing down. I also remember, Kieran continued, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd done his research, that Bloodfang Alpha Kane died 3 months after your exile. Mysterious circumstances. No witnesses. Very convenient. The implication hung in the air like poison gas. Zane had killed an alpha, not in fair combat, not in defense of pack law, but in cold-blood revenge. The kind of action that put a permanent target on someone's back. Here's what's going to happen, Kieran said, his tone reasonable and utterly implacable. You're going to walk away from this madness. Leave her and rejoin civilization. I'll even sponsor your application to Shadowmoon, give you the pack bond you've been craving, the status you've been denied, a chance to matter again. The offer was everything Zane had been denied for years. Pack membership, respect, a place to belong that didn't depend on running from one territory to the next like a ghost. All he had to do was abandon the woman who'd awakened something he thought was dead. For one heartbreaking second, Zane hesitated. Lyra saw it in the way his shoulders tensed, in the flicker of longing that crossed his scarred features. The hunger for acceptance was written in every line of his body, the desperate need to belong somewhere that didn't require constantly looking over his shoulder. She understood. More than anyone, she understood what it felt like to be offered the thing you'd always wanted in exchange for betraying the thing you'd never expected to find. Go, she said quietly, silver fire dimming around her hands. I'm used to being abandoned. The words came out steady, almost gentle, but they hit Zane like physical blows. He spun toward her, amber eyes wide with something that looked like panic. Lyra, it's fine, she continued, putting all the strength she possessed into sounding like she meant it. You don't owe me anything. We barely know each other. Take the offer. Live. For a moment, the entire circle held its breath. Kieran smiled with the satisfaction of someone who'd just solved a complex problem with elegant simplicity. Scarlet pushed herself to her feet, already composing the story she'd tell about the night they'd finally put down the Nightflame curse. Then Zane laughed. The sound was rough, damaged by his scarred throat, but it carried genuine amusement that made everyone freeze in confusion. You know what I've learned about offers that sound too good to be true? He asked, amber eyes never leaving Lyra's face. They usually are. Before anyone could react, he was moving, not toward Kieran and the promise of pack membership, but directly at the Alpha with lethal intent. His claws found the space between Kieran's ribs with surgical precision, not deep enough to kill but more than enough to prove a point. I choose her, he said simply, as Kieran staggered backward with blood spreading across his shirt. I choose the dangerous path. I choose the impossible prophecy. I choose the woman who burns bright enough to light the way through darkness. The confession hit Lyra like a physical force, sending warmth through her chest that had nothing to do with silver fire. He'd chosen her over safety, over acceptance, over everything he'd been denied for years. Chosen her not despite what she was, but because of it. Foolish, Kieran hissed, pressing a hand to his wounded side. Kill them both. No more games. The hunters moved as one, a wall of silver weapons and hostile intent that left no room for escape. Zane spun back toward Lyra, amber eyes meeting hers across the chaos with desperate intensity. Run, he commanded. Different directions. They can't track us both. I won't leave you, you have to. His voice carried the authority of someone who'd been making life or death decisions since childhood. The prophecy matters more than either of us. Live, Lyra, burn bright enough to save them all. The logic was sound, but it felt like tearing her heart out through her throat. They'd just found each other, just discovered what it felt like to be chosen instead of abandoned. Now he was asking her to run while he faced impossible odds alone. Find me at Broken Moon Ridge, he said as arrows began to fly. 3 days. We finish this together. She ran because staying meant watching him die for her sake, because the prophecy that had marked her carried responsibilities beyond her own happiness. Because sometimes love meant making choices that felt like dying. Silver fire exploded around her as she fled the sacred circle, leaving a trail of melted snow and scorched earth that would make tracking difficult. Behind her, she heard the sounds of battle, Zane's damaged roar of challenge, the clash of claws against weapons, Kieran's shouted commands. She didn't look back. Looking back would have broken her resolve, and she couldn't afford to be broken when the wolf realm needed her to be strong. 3 days, she told herself as she ran through the ancient forest with tears freezing on her cheeks. 3 days until Broken Moon Ridge. 3 days to figure out how to embrace a destiny she'd never wanted while staying one step ahead of hunters who wouldn't stop until she was dead. Behind her, the battle raged in the sacred sanctuary, but she forced herself to keep running. The silver crescent moon on her collarbone pulsed with each heartbeat, a constant reminder of what she'd become and what she'd lost in the same terrible night. The Nightflame heir, the prophesied savior, the monster they all feared, but for the first time in her life, she wasn't running away from what she was. She was running toward what she could become, even if it killed her, even if it killed them all. The hunt had begun, and this time, she wouldn't be prey. 3 days felt like 3 lifetimes. Lyra crouched beside the hidden pool behind Moonfall Falls, her reflection fractured by ripples that caught the silver light, emanating from crystalline formations embedded in the cave walls. The sound of cascading water created a curtain of privacy, masking any scent or sound that might give away her location to the hunters she knew were still tracking her. Her fingertips traced the 4 parallel scars Scarlet's claws had left across her cheek, fresh wounds that would mark her face permanently, adding to the collection of evidence that she didn't belong anywhere civilized. The cuts had stopped bleeding, but they throbbed with each heartbeat, a constant reminder of how quickly hope could turn to violence. Silver tears slipped down her face, each drop glowing faintly in the cave's ethereal light before disappearing into the dark water. She hadn't meant to cry. Crying was weakness, and she couldn't afford weakness when half the wolf realm wanted her dead and the other half wanted to use her as a weapon. But the tears came anyway, carrying 3 days' worth of fear and loneliness and the terrible certainty that Zane was probably dead because he'd chosen her over survival. I told you to find me here, a familiar voice said from the cave entrance, rough with exhaustion but absolutely, impossibly alive. Not sit here crying like I wasn't coming. She spun toward the sound, silver fire flaring around her hands in defensive arcs before her brain caught up with her heart. Zane stood silhouetted against the waterfall, his clothes torn and blood-stained, fresh cuts decorating his arms and face like evidence of the battles he'd fought to reach her, but he was breathing, moving, alive. Relief hit her so hard she nearly collapsed, silver flames dimming to gentle flickers around her fingertips. You came, I said I would. He stepped into the cave proper, Amber Eyes taking in her wounds with the careful assessment of someone who'd learned to catalog damage for survival purposes. Though you look like you've been having your own adventures, she touched the scars on her cheek self-consciously. 3 days of hiding in caves and ruins, eating whatever she could forage, staying one step ahead of search parties that seemed to multiply every time she thought she'd lost them. The facial wounds had gotten infected despite her attempts to clean them, adding fever and nausea to the list of problems she couldn't solve alone. Scarlett's parting gift, she said, trying to sound casual about the marks that would define how people saw her for the rest of her life. I suppose I should be grateful she didn't aim for my throat. Zane's expression went dangerously still. She marked you. The quiet fury in his voice sent heat through her chest that had nothing to do with silver fire. He was angry on her behalf. She realized, not disgusted by her new scars, not calculating how they affected her value, just furious that someone had hurt her. It doesn't matter, she said quickly, because letting him see how much the scarring bothered her felt like admitting defeat. Facial scars are the least of our problems. It matters to me. He moved closer, each step deliberate and careful, like approaching a wounded animal that might bolt. Let me see. She wanted to refuse, to keep the damaged side of her face turned away from his scrutiny. Everyone who'd seen the fresh wounds had recoiled not just from the cuts themselves, but from what they represented, evidence that she was dangerous to be around, marked by violence that followed her like a curse. But something in his amber eyes made her turn toward the light, exposing the 4 parallel lines that carved from her temple to her jaw. The cuts were healing, but they'd leave permanent scars that would identify her as easily as the silver crescent moon on her collarbone. Zane studied the wounds with clinical detachment, then moved to the pool's edge and soaked a piece of cloth, torn from his shirt. When he returned, his touch was gentle enough to make her breath catch. These need proper cleaning, he said, dabbing away dried blood and infection with surprising care. Cave water isn't exactly sterile. The cloth was cool against her fevered skin, and his proximity filled her senses with pine forests and winter nights and something uniquely male that made her inner wolf stretch with contentment. He worked in focused silence, cleaning each cut, with the patience of someone who'd learned to tend his own wounds in solitude. Everyone who sees my true face leaves, she whispered, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Even my own mate rejected me before I was scarred. Now I look like exactly what they always said I was a monster. Zane's hand stilled against her cheek, amber eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her forget to breathe. Then they were blind. I see strength, not scars. I see someone who's survived everything the world threw at her and kept burning bright. The simple conviction in his voice cracked something open in her chest, letting light into places that had been dark for so long she'd forgotten they existed. He wasn't trying to convince her the scars didn't matter or that they somehow made her more beautiful. He was acknowledging the damage while refusing to let it define her worth. These marks remind me who I really am, he continued, his scarred fingers tracing the old wounds across his throat. Someone who fights for those who can't fight back. Your scars tell the same story. You stood up to them. You didn't back down. Even when they tried to mark you as theirs to destroy. She stared at him, this broken Omega who spoke about scars like battle honors instead of shame. How are you not angry? How are you not bitter about what they did to you? Something dark flickered across his features. Who says I'm not? The quiet menace in his voice sent shivers down her spine that had nothing to do with cold. Tell me. He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he settled beside her on the smooth stone, close enough that their shoulders touched, and began to speak in the careful cadence of someone sharing secrets that could get them both killed. I was born to an Omega mother who never told me my father's name. Raised in the Bloodfang Pack's servant quarters, invisible until I wasn't anymore. His amber eyes reflected the crystal light as he stared into the dark water. When I was 16, Alpha Kieran decided that Omega children made good stress relief for his beta officers. The casual way he said it made her stomach clench with horror. Zane, 6 children that first night, he continued, his damaged voice carrying old pain that had crystallized into something harder than diamond. The youngest was 8 years old. Cain said it would teach them their proper place in the pack hierarchy. Rage exploded through her chest like molten silver, so intense. It made the cave crystals pulse brighter. "What did you do?" I challenged him, publicly, called him out for violating every law that made us more than animals. Zane's laugh was bitter as broken glass. "They crushed my larynx for speaking against an alpha, marked me as a broken omega and exiled me from pack territory. Said I'd brought shame on my bloodline by forgetting my place." She could see its 16-year-old Zane standing up to an alpha twice his size, knowing exactly what it would cost him but unable to stay silent while children were brutalized. The kind of moral courage that got people killed but sometimes, just sometimes, changed the world. "But you said Cain died 3 months later." "Mysterious circumstances," Zane agreed, amber eyes holding hers with steady calm. "No witnesses." Very convenient. The confirmation sent heat through her blood that had nothing to do with her silver fire. He'd killed an alpha in cold blood revenge, violated every law of pack hierarchy, and he'd do it again without hesitation if the situation demanded it. "Do you regret it?" "Only that I waited 3 months." His scarred hand found hers, fingers intertwining with surprising gentleness. "These marks remind me who I am, someone who protects those who can't protect themselves, even when it costs everything." The parallel between them was impossible to miss. Both marked by violence, both cast out for refusing to accept injustice, both carrying scars that told stories of choosing others over themselves. "I killed someone once," she said quietly, the confession spilling out like poison from an infected wound. "A rogue who was threatening pack children. But when I used my flames, there was nothing left but ash." The memory hit her like a physical blow. 7 years old, silver fire erupting from her small hands, the rogue's scream cutting off abruptly as he simply ceased. Not burned, not wounded, but unmade at the molecular level by power she couldn't control. "I see his face every time I close my eyes," she continued, silver tears slipping down her cheeks. "What if I'm not protecting people? What if I'm just destroying them? What if the prophecy is wrong, and I'm meant to burn everything down instead of saving it?" "Monsters don't lose sleep over their victims," Zane said simply, his thumb brushing away her glowing tears. "They don't spend years agonizing over choices they made to save innocent lives. You're not what they say you are, Lyra. You're what they're afraid they could never be." The certainty in his voice cut through 7 years of guilt and self-hatred, offering her something she'd never expected to find: absolution from someone who understood what it felt like to carry blood on your hands for the sake of others. "Why do you see something in me that no one else does?" she whispered, leaning into his touch despite every instinct that screamed touching people only led to pain. "Because I was there that night," he said quietly. "The rogue you killed? He was about to murder me and 6 other Omega children. You saved us all." The world tilted on its axis. "That's impossible." "You would have been 9 years old," he confirmed, "hidden in the storage cellar with 5 other children while our parents fought the rogue pack attack upstairs. He found us. Said Omega children would make good slaves or good examples, depending on how cooperative we were." Memory fragments crashed over her, a child's terrified scream, silver fire erupting in desperate protection, the scent of burned flesh and the weight of taking a life to save others. But now she could see his face in the memory, amber eyes wide with terror and hope as silver flames consumed the monster reaching for him. "You've been my guardian angel for 7 years," he continued, scarred hand cupping her face with reverent gentleness. "I just never knew your name." The revelation hit her like lightning, reframing everything she'd believed about that night. Not a moment of destructive loss of control, but a deliberate choice to protect the innocent. Not evidence of her monstrous nature, but proof of her heroic heart. "You're not broken," she breathed, finally understanding why he'd appeared in her life like an answer to prayers she'd never dared to voice. "You're the strongest person I've ever met. I see you, Lyra Nightshade," he said, amber eyes holding hers with devastating honesty. All of you. The fire, the fear, the heart that bleeds for everyone else. I choose you. Always. The words hung between them like a vow, heavy with promise and possibility. They were sitting by the crystal-lit pool, close enough that she could feel his breath against her skin, close enough that the space between them felt like an invitation. Silver flames danced around her fingertips as her heart rate spiked, responding to proximity and attraction and the overwhelming need to close the distance between them. I can't, she whispered, even as her body swayed toward his. Everyone I touch gets hurt, then hurt me, he said simply, reaching out to grasp her flaming hand without flinching. I'm already broken. What's a little more damage? The silver fire wrapped around their joined hands like liquid starlight, but instead of burning him, it seemed to recognize something familiar. The flames turned warm instead of cold, protective instead of destructive, dancing between their fingers like blessing instead of curse. Impossible, she breathed. Everything about us is impossible, he replied, his free hand sliding into her hair with careful reverence. Might as well embrace it. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, full of months of longing and the taste of silver fire. But when she didn't pull away, when she leaned into him instead of fleeing, it deepened into something desperate and necessary and absolutely right. The cave crystals pulsed brighter around them, resonating with their connection in ways that defied every law of physics she'd ever learned. The silver flames that had always been cold burned warm for the first time in her life, wrapping around them both like protection instead of destruction. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, she realized something fundamental had shifted. The constant ache of isolation that had lived in her chest for years had eased, replaced by something that felt dangerously close to belonging. What happens now? She whispered against his lips. Now we rest, he said, drawing her down beside the small fire he'd built while she wasn't paying attention. Tomorrow we figure out how to save the world. Tonight we just exist. She curled against his side as naturally as breathing, her silver flames dancing around them both to ward off the cave's chill. His arm tightened around her shoulders, anchor and promise and home all wrapped in scarred skin and damaged vocal cords. For the first time in years, when sleep finally claimed her, Lyra didn't dream of burning forests or terrified faces or the weight of destruction she couldn't control. She dreamed of amber eyes and gentle hands and the revolutionary possibility that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to face the darkness alone. When morning came, filtering through the waterfall in fractured rainbows, they woke still entwined by the dying embers of their fire. The crystal formations had dimmed to gentle glows, and the sound of falling water continued its endless song of privacy and peace. But the world was still waiting outside their sanctuary. The hunters were still tracking them. The prophecy still demanded fulfillment, and somewhere in the darkness beyond their cave, ancient evils stirred with renewed hunger. The sanctuary couldn't last forever. But for one perfect night, it had been enough. Something deeper than mate bond had formed between them in the crystal-lit darkness, not biological compulsion, but conscious choice. Not destiny written in genetics, but love freely given despite every reason to guard their hearts. Ready? Zane asked, amber eyes serious as he prepared to face whatever came next. Lyra touched the silver crescent moon on her collarbone, feeling the weight of prophecy and possibility in equal measure. Together, always, they stepped through the waterfall and into whatever hell awaited them, but they didn't step into it alone. And that, somehow, made all the difference. The message arrived at dawn, carried by a raven whose black eyes held too much intelligence for a natural bird. Lyra caught the creature as it landed on her outstretched arm, its talons digging through her sleeve with painful precision. The scroll tied to its leg was bound with silver thread that burned her fingertips, but she unrolled it anyway, her heart sinking with each word. Children taken. Moonhaven territory. Shadow creatures holding 12 young ones in the old amphitheater. Need Nightflame power to break their bindings. Time runs short. Come alone or watch them die. A friendly parchment crumbled to ash in her hands, but the words burned themselves into her memory with the clarity of absolute horror. 12 children. The same number as the Omega children Zane had been protecting when she'd saved them 7 years ago. The same number that haunted her dreams when she wondered if her power was meant to destroy rather than protect. It's a trap, Zane said immediately, reading her expression with the accuracy of someone who'd learned to survive by interpreting micro-expressions. Everything about this screams ambush. She knew he was right. The timing was too convenient, the message too perfectly crafted to exploit her greatest weakness, the inability to ignore children in danger. But knowing it was a trap and being able to walk away were two entirely different things. What if it's not? The question came out raw with desperation. What if there really are children out there, and I'm so paranoid from being hunted that I let them die because I was afraid to act? Then we go in smart, Zane replied, amber eyes already calculating angles and escape routes. Together, armed, ready to fight our way out when the trap springs. The message said to come alone. The message can go to hell. The fierce protectiveness in his voice sent warmth through her chest, despite the cold dread settling in her stomach. But even as they prepared to leave their sanctuary, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking toward something that would change everything. Moonhaven sat in neutral territory between the 7 major pack lands, a place where ancient laws demanded safe passage for all wolf kind. The amphitheater dated back centuries, carved into living rock by the first pack leaders who tried to create lasting peace between the bloodlines. They approached from the south, moving through early morning mist that clung to the ground like ghostly fingers. The silence was wrong. No bird songs, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush, no scents carried on the wind except for the metallic tang of old magic and something else. Something that made her silver fire flicker with nervous energy. Do you smell that? She whispered as they crested the hill overlooking the amphitheater. Blood, Zane replied grimly. Old blood. And his nostrils flared as he tested the air more carefully. Pack leaders. All of them. The amphitheater spread below them like a wound carved into the earth, its stone seats arranged in perfect circles around a central stage. But instead of the expected shadow creatures and terrified children, 7 figures stood in ceremonial robes around an obsidian altar that pulsed with malevolent energy. Alpha Kieran, Beta Scarlet, leaders from each of the major packs, all watching the entrance with the patient stillness of predators who knew their prey was already caught. We leave. Now, Zane commanded, his hand finding hers with urgent pressure. But before they could retreat, another voice cut through the morning air like a blade through silk. Hello, granddaughter. The world tilted sideways. Elder Malaki Stormwind stepped out from behind one of the stone pillars, and Lyra's breath stopped in her throat. He looked exactly as she remembered from childhood, tall, silver-haired, carrying himself with the kind of authority that made other wolves automatically defer. The grandfather who'd supposedly died in a rogue attack when she was 12, whose funeral she'd attended, whose grave she'd visited every year until her exile. Surprised to see me. Malachi's smile held no warmth, only the satisfaction of a chess player revealing a winning move. I've been watching you, granddaughter, waiting for your power to fully awaken. You're dead. The words came out flat with shock. I saw your body. I was at your funeral. You saw what I needed you to see, he replied, moving down the amphitheater steps with measured grace. A necessary deception to ensure you developed properly. The Nightflame power requires emotional trauma to mature. Grief works almost as well as rejection. The casual way he spoke of manipulating her pain made silver fire erupt around her hands in defensive arcs. You've been orchestrating everything. The rejection, the exile, the hunt, all carefully designed to force your abilities to their full potential. Malaki gestured toward the assembled pack leaders with paternal pride. We've been planning this for years, waiting for you to become exactly what the wolf realm needs. A weapon, she whispered, understanding flooding through her like ice water. A sacrifice, he corrected gently. The prophecy speaks of unity, granddaughter. Through your willing gift, the packs will finally be one. The obsidian altar pulsed brighter, and she could see the silver chains coiled around its base, not ordinary restraints, but bonds inscribed with power-draining runes specifically designed to contain Nightflame magic. They'd been planning this for years, studying her abilities, preparing the perfect trap. The children, she said numbly. There never were any children. Bait, Kieran confirmed, stepping forward with the casual confidence of someone revealing a successful deception. We knew you couldn't resist a threat to innocence. Your greatest weakness has always been your soft heart. The betrayal hit her like physical blows, each revelation driving her to her knees on the stone steps. Not just the pack leaders, but her own family. Not just political maneuvering, but years of calculated emotional abuse designed to shape her into the perfect victim. You ordered him to reject me, she said, looking at Kieran with dawning horror. My mate bond, my exile, my suffering, all of it was planned. Emotional awakening requires emotional trauma, Malaki explained with the patience of someone discussing weather patterns. We needed your power at full strength before we could safely extract it. Extract it? Silver fire flared around her as the true horror of their plan became clear. You're not trying to control my power. You're trying to steal it. The Nightflame ability is too dangerous for one person. Alpha Ravencrest of the Ironwood Pack spoke for the first time, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making life or death decisions. Divided among the 7 packs, it becomes manageable, useful, safe. Safe for who? Lyra demanded, silver flames growing brighter with each word. Safe for the power structure that's kept the packs fighting each other for centuries? Safe for the leaders who benefit from division and hatred? Safe for everyone, Malaki replied firmly, including you, granddaughter. Once the power is properly distributed, you can live a normal life, find a suitable mate, bear children who won't carry this terrible burden. The offer should have been tempting. After years of being feared and rejected, the promise of normalcy held its own seductive appeal. But all she could think about was the prophecy, the Shadow King stirring in ancient darkness, the wolf realm tearing itself apart while its leaders played political games. The real threat, she said slowly, pieces falling together with sickening clarity. You know about the Shadow King. You know something's coming. Malachi's expression flickered, revealing the first crack in his composed facade. Ancient enemies require ancient solutions. The shadow magic users have offered assistance in containing the Nightflame power. You're working with them. The words came out flat with disbelief. You're actually working with shadow magic to steal my power. We're doing what's necessary to preserve the wolf realm, he replied. But there was defensiveness in his voice now. Sometimes the greater good requires difficult choices. The ritual circle was already prepared, she realized. The obsidian altar, the power-draining chains, the ancient words carved into the stone, everything needed to strip her abilities and divide them among the pack leaders. They'd been planning this for years, waiting for her to develop enough power to make the theft worthwhile. And in the center of it all sat an offer that made her heart clench with terrible understanding. Zane Ashworth, Alpha Bloodclaw, stepped forward, his voice carrying the weight of pack law and political necessity. You don't have to die for her mistakes. Join us. We'll give you everything you've been denied: pack membership, status, respect. Choose any unmated female from any pack as your mate. All you have to do is step aside. The offer hung in the air like poison gas, beautiful and deadly in its simplicity. Everything Zane had been denied for years: belonging, acceptance, the chance to matter in a world that had marked him as disposable. All he had to do was abandon her to a fate she couldn't escape alone. For one heartbreaking moment, Zane went perfectly still. She could see the war playing out across his scarred features, the desperate hunger for acceptance warring with the loyalty he'd chosen to give her. The promise of pack bonds and status and a mate who wouldn't carry the curse of silver fire. A life where he wouldn't have to run or hide or fight impossible odds just to survive. Go, she said quietly, silver fire dimming around her hands as she made the choice for him. You've suffered enough for my cursed bloodline. Take what they're offering. Live. The words tasted like ash, but she meant them. He'd already sacrificed more than anyone should ask, given up his only chance at belonging to stand with someone the world had marked for destruction. She wouldn't let him throw away his future for her sake. Zane, she continued when he didn't move, didn't speak, didn't react. Please, I can't watch you die for me. He looked at her then, amber eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her forget to breathe. Then he turned toward the assembled pack leaders, toward the promise of everything he'd always wanted, toward the chance to finally belong somewhere. Tempting offer, he said conversationally, his damaged voice carrying across the stone amphitheater with surprising clarity. Pack membership, status, respect, a mate of my choosing. Everything I've been denied my whole life. Hope flickered in Malachi's eyes. You're wise to consider it, young man. This doesn't have to end in bloodshed. You're right, Zane agreed, reaching into his jacket with slow, deliberate movements. It doesn't. The shadow blade appeared in his hand like solidified darkness, its edge humming with power that made the air itself seem to vibrate. Not a weapon, forged in any pack territory, but something older, something that predated the current political structure by centuries. I've been hunting you for 3 days, he said to Lyra, amber eyes never leaving hers as he moved toward the ritual circle. To give you this, the blade that could cut through any magical binding, the one weapon that could sever power-draining chains designed specifically to contain Nightflame magic. You're making a mistake, Kieran warned, but his voice carried the edge of someone who'd just realized his careful plans were falling apart. I've made lots of mistakes, Zane replied, raising the shadow blade as silver chains erupted from the ground to wrap around Lyra's wrists and ankles. This isn't one of them. The ritual began with ancient words that made her bones ache and her silver fire surge wildly against the restraints. But the chains held, draining her power even as she fought against them, leaving her feeling hollow and cold for the first time in years. The flame that burns brightest must be contained before it consumes all, Malachi chanted, his voice taking on the cadence of ritual magic. Through willing sacrifice, the scattered become one. Power flowed out of her in streams of liquid silver, drawn toward the obsidian altar where it pooled like molten starlight. But instead of being destroyed, it was being redirected, channeled toward the 7 pack leaders who stood ready to claim their portions. You're not trying to save the packs, she gasped, silver fire flickering weakly around her chained wrists. You're trying to control them. Divide the power among yourselves so no one else can challenge your authority. Sometimes the greater good requires difficult choices, Malachi repeated, but there was satisfaction in his voice now. Your sacrifice will bring peace to the wolf realm. Peace through subjugation, Zane snarled, the shadow blade singing as it cut through the first of her restraints. Peace through control, the same lies every tyrant tells while crushing those beneath them. The chain parted like silk under the ancient weapon's edge, and silver fire erupted from her freed hand in a surge of cold flame that made the assembled pack leaders stumble backward. But there were still 3 chains holding her, still draining her power faster than she could restore it. Stop him, Kieran commanded, but his hunters hesitated, suddenly unsure whether they were witnessing salvation or damnation. Zane cut through the 2nd chain, then the 3rd, moving with fluid grace despite the spells being hurled at him from 7 different directions. The shadow blade seemed to absorb the magic, growing darker and more substantial with each attack it deflected. When he severed the final chain, Lyra's power exploded outward like a nova of silver fire, washing over the amphitheater in waves of cold flame that cracked ancient stone and sent the pack leaders scrambling for cover. Free from the restraints, she felt her abilities return in a rush that made her gasp with relief and fury in equal measure. They'd tried to steal her birthright, her heritage, her very identity. Tried to reduce her to a convenient source of power they could divide among themselves like spoils of war. You want to see what the Nightflame power can really do? She asked, silver fire crowning her head like a diadem made of starlight and rage. Let me show you why your ancestors were so afraid of us. the amphitheater filled with cold flame that burned without consuming, light that revealed truth instead of destroying it. Under its touch, she could see the shadow magic corruption that clung to half the pack leaders, the darkness they'd welcomed into their souls in exchange for the promise of stolen power. "Run," she commanded, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd finally embraced what she was meant to become. "All of you, run before I decide that mercy is a luxury I can no longer afford." They ran, even Malaki, even Kieran, even the pack leaders who'd ruled their territories with iron authority for decades. They fled from the silver fire that showed them exactly what they'd tried to steal, exactly what they'd never be worthy to wield. When the amphitheater was empty except for broken chains and scorched stone, Lyra finally let the flames die. The effort left her shaking, drained from the power drain and the emotional devastation of discovering how deep the betrayal ran. "Everyone," she whispered, silver tears slipping down her cheeks. "Everyone I thought might accept me was part of the trap." Zane was beside her instantly, his scarred hands gentle as they helped her stand on legs that trembled with exhaustion. "Not everyone. My own grandfather saw me as a tool to be used and discarded." The words came out broken, carrying years of longing for family acceptance that had been weaponized against her. "He planned my suffering, orchestrated my pain, made me into exactly what he needed me to become. But he failed," Zane pointed out, amber eyes fierce with protective fury. "He tried to break you, and instead you became exactly what the world needs. Not his weapon, not their sacrifice. Something they never planned for." "What's that?" "Free." The word hung between them like a promise and a declaration of war. Free from the chains of pack politics. Free from the expectation that she should be. Grateful for any scrap of acceptance thrown her way. Free to choose her own path instead of following scripts written by people who saw her as a means to an end. "Maybe they're right," she said quietly, looking at the scorched stone where her power had revealed uncomfortable truths. "Maybe I am too dangerous to exist." "Then be dangerous," Zane replied simply. "Be so dangerous that they think twice before trying to cage another child with power they fear. Be dangerous enough that the next person born with gifts instead of curses gets to choose their own destiny." The fierce conviction in his voice ignited something in her chest that burned brighter than silver fire. Not the cold rage of betrayal, but the warm fury of someone who'd finally had enough of being treated as less than human. They tried to steal her power, failed. Tried to break her spirit, failed. Tried to turn her into their willing sacrifice, failed. Now it was her turn to make the choices. Her turn to decide what the Nightflame legacy would become. Her turn to rewrite the prophecy in terms that didn't require her destruction. The Shadow King was stirring. Ancient darkness was spreading across the wolf realm. The packs were tearing themselves apart with hatred and fear. Fine, let them. She was done trying to save people who saw her as a convenient weapon, done sacrificing herself for the greater good as defined by those who benefited from her suffering. From now on, she would be exactly what they'd always accused her of being: dangerous, unpredictable, and absolutely unwilling to accept the world as it was. "What now?" Zane asked, amber eyes holding hers with steady support. "Now we stop playing by their rules," she replied, silver fire dancing around her fingertips with newfound purpose. "Now we remind them why their ancestors were so afraid of the Nightflame bloodline." Together, always, they walked out of the amphitheater side by side, leaving behind the broken chains and scorched stone that marked the end of one story and the beginning of another. Behind them, the obsidian altar cracked down the middle, its power-stealing magic destroyed by the very force it had tried to contain. The betrayal had cut deeper than any physical wound, shattered trust that might never fully heal. But it had also burned away the last of her illusions, the desperate hope that somewhere in this world was a place she could belong without hiding what she was. She was done hiding, done apologizing, done being anyone's victim. The wolf realm wanted a monster? Fine, she'd give them exactly that. And when the darkness finally came for them all, when the Shadow King rose and the old divisions proved as fragile as morning mist, They would discover the difference between a weapon you control and a force of nature you've chosen to unleash. The Nightflame heir was no longer interested in salvation, she was interested in justice. And justice, as they were about to learn, burned far brighter than any flame they'd ever tried to steal. They hadn't made it a mile from the amphitheater when the screaming started. Not human screams, something far worse. The high, terrified cries of children. In mortal danger, carried on a wind that tasted of shadow and despair. Lyra's steps faltered as the sound hit her like a physical blow, silver fire flaring around her hands in instinctive response. The children, she breathed, understanding crashing over her with sickening clarity. There really are children, Zane's. Amber eyes went hard as flint. Malachi's backup plan. Keep you distracted with the ritual while the real threat unfolds. The wind shifted, bringing with it scents that made her inner wolf cower in primordial terror. Corruption. Ancient darkness. The kind of evil that existed before wolves learned to shift, before the first packs formed, before light and shadow were separated into distinct forces. While the pack leaders had been playing their political games, something far older and infinitely more dangerous had been moving in the darkness. Using their distraction, their greed, their willingness to traffic with shadow magic to achieve their petty goals. The sacred grove, she said, recognition hitting her like lightning. That's where the screaming is coming from. The grove where she'd accidentally burned down the ceremonial trees as a child, where her power had first manifested in terror and destruction, where the pack had learned to fear what she might become. They ran through forest that grew darker, with each step, not from failing daylight, but from something that devoured illumination itself. The trees became twisted, their branches reaching toward them like gnarsping claws. Shadows moved independently of their sources, pooling in places where no shadows should exist. Stay close, Zane commanded, the shadow blade appearing in his hand as they navigated the increasingly hostile terrain. Whatever's in there, it's been feeding on pack divisions for years. Growing stronger while everyone focused on ancient grudges, the grove appeared before them like a wound in reality itself. Where sacred oaks had once stood, now there were only blackened stumps surrounded by cages made of crystallized darkness. Inside each cage, a child, 12 young wolves ranging in age from 6 to 14, their eyes wide with terror as shadow creatures circled like hungry vultures. But these weren't the rogue threats or magical barriers she'd faced before. These entities were older, hungrier, feeding on fear and hatred with an appetite that seemed bottomless. They moved like liquid darkness given form, occasionally revealing glimpses of what they'd once been wolves, alphas, pack leaders who'd chosen shadow over light so long ago their original forms were barely recognizable. At the center of it all stood Malachi, but not the grandfather she remembered, not even the calculating manipulator from the amphitheater. This version of him was partially consumed by shadow, darkness flowing through his veins like infected blood. His eyes burned with unholy light, and when he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that belonged to something far older than any living. "Wolf, granddaughter," he said, turning toward them with a smile that revealed teeth like obsidian daggers. "Right on time, though I admit, I expected you to arrive." "Diminished. The ritual failed," she replied, silver fire blazing around her hands as she took in the scope of what he'd unleashed. "Your shadow magic friends didn't get what they bargained for." "Oh, but they did," Malachi gestured toward the caged children, his movements fluid in ways that defied normal anatomy. 12 young souls, perfect vessels for ancient spirits seeking return. The power drain was never the real goal, it was the distraction. Horror clenched her stomach as understanding dawned. While she'd been fighting for her own survival, while the pack leaders had been trying to steal her abilities, the real plan had been unfolding here, using her as bait, using the political chaos as cover, while shadow entities prepared to possess the next generation of wolves. "You're going to let them take the children's bodies," she whispered, revulsion making her voice shake. I'm going to facilitate the return of the old masters, Malaki corrected, shadow corruption spreading visibly across his skin as he spoke. The Shadow King and his court require physical forms to manifest fully. What better vessels than young wolves with decades of life ahead of them? One of the children, a girl no more than 7 with dark hair and familiar green eyes, pressed against the bars of her shadow cage and called out in desperate hope. Help us, please. We tried to run, but they were too fast. Scarlet's little sister, the Beta's family, taken as insurance or perhaps simple cruelty. Either way, the sight of that small face twisted with terror burned away the last of Lyra's uncertainty. She was done being afraid of her own power, done letting other people's fear dictate her choices, done being anything other than exactly what these children needed her to be. I am Lyra Nightshade, heir of Luna's flame, she declared, silver fire erupting around her in waves that turned night to blazing day. I am not your sacrifice. The transformation was immediate and absolute. Silver flames didn't just crown her head, they became her, flowing through her veins like liquid starlight until she was more fire than flesh. Her eyes blazed with the intensity of newborn stars, and when she took a step forward, the very ground beneath her feet glowed with residual power. Beside her, Zane had undergone his own transformation. No longer the broken Omega hiding in shadows, but a warrior who'd chosen his battles and found his purpose. The shadow blade in his hand hummed with dark energy, not evil but protective shadows that guarded light instead of consuming it. Impossible. Malaki breathed, but there was fear in his corrupted voice now. You're too young, too untrained. The power should have burned you out years ago. Maybe it would have, she agreed, silver flames dancing around her fingertips as she advanced on the shadow cages. If I'd been trying to contain it instead of embracing it. If I'd been fighting what I am instead of becoming who I was meant to be. The shadow creatures turned toward her with predatory focus, recognizing a threat to their feast. But when they moved to attack, they discovered that silver fire wasn't just light, it was truth. Under its touch, their stolen forms began to dissolve, revealing the corrupted wolves beneath centuries of accumulated darkness. The flame burns brightest in darkness, a familiar voice whispered in her mind. Rise, daughter, claim your birthright. Luna Nightflame materialized beside her, not solid but present, her ancient power flowing into Lyra like a river of molten silver. Around them, other figures began to appear, the spirits of her bloodline, the ancestors who'd been hunted to extinction for carrying this very flame. You are not alone, Luna said, her voice carrying the weight of centuries. You have never been alone. We have been waiting, watching, preparing for this moment when darkness thought it had won. The battle erupted with the fury of elemental forces unleashed. Lyra moved through the shadow creatures like vengeance given form, silver fire burning away corruption that had festered for centuries. Each enemy she touched didn't die, they were purified, the wolves they'd once been separated from the darkness that had consumed them. Zane fought beside her with fluid grace, his shadow blade carving through crystallized darkness like it was made of morning mist. Where her power was revelation and purification, his was protection and precision, covering her blind spots, ensuring none of the creatures could reach the caged children. Together, they were devastating. The shadow cages began to crack under the assault of combined light and protective darkness. Children who'd been trapped for hours started to stir with hope, reaching toward the silver flames that promised salvation instead of destruction. But as the lesser shadows fell, something far more dangerous stirred in the grove's depths. Ancient stones buried beneath centuries of leaf litter began to glow with awakened power. Ley lines of energy that crisscrossed the continent lit up like silver highways, responding to the Nightflame heir finally claiming her full potential. Across the wolf realm, dormant bloodlines felt the call, forgotten abilities stirring in wolves who'd thought themselves ordinary. The very foundations of pack hierarchy shuddered as power redistributed itself according to older, truer laws. Do you see what you've done? Malaki demanded, shadow corruption racing across his skin as he struggled to maintain his form. The old bloodlines are awakening. The careful balance we've maintained for centuries is crumbling. Good, Lyra replied, silver fire reaching toward the first of the shadow cages. Maybe it's time for something better than careful balance built on lies and fear. Her flames touched the crystallized darkness, and it dissolved like sugar in rain. The child inside Scarlet's little sister stumbled free with a sob of relief, running toward Lyra without the fear that usually greeted her presence. Thank you, the girl whispered, small arms wrapping around Lyra's waist with desperate gratitude. I knew someone would come. I knew the Silver Fire Lady would save us. The trust in that young voice hit harder than any weapon. Here was a child who saw her power as salvation rather than threat, who recognized the protective heart beneath the dangerous abilities. Everything the pack leaders had told her about her own nature crumbled in the face of innocent acceptance. One by one, she freed the other children, each cage dissolving under her touch like ice in summer sun. They gathered around her not in fear but in reverence. 12 young wolves who would grow up knowing that power could be used to protect instead of control. But as the last cage fell, Malaki made his desperate move. I tried to protect the world. From your fire, he roared, shadow corruption consuming the last of his original form. The Nightflame bloodline destroys everything it touches. I've seen the vision cities burning, packs torn apart, civilization reduced to ash. You tried to cage the sun and wondered why everything grew cold, she replied, turning to face the grandfather who'd orchestrated her suffering out of misguided love. You saw destruction because you were looking at the end of a corrupt system, not the end of the world. The choice crystallized before her with perfect clarity. Let the shadows claim him completely, or burn away the corruption and save what remained of the wolf who'd once taught her to catch fireflies in mason jars. Mercy or justice, vengeance or healing, the old ways or something new. She chose healing. Silver fire erupted around Malaki not to destroy but to purify, burning away centuries of shadow corruption with surgical precision. He screamed as the darkness was ripped away from his soul, but when the flames faded, he was himself again diminished, powerless, but recognizably the grandfather she'd loved before learning how deep his betrayal ran. I am not the monster you made me believe I was, she said quietly, helping him to his feet despite everything he'd done. And neither are you, just a frightened old wolf who thought control was the same thing as protection. Around them, the grove began to change. Where shadow corruption had twisted the land, new growth sprouted, not the sacred oaks that had been destroyed, but something different. Trees that glowed with gentle silver light, their branches reaching toward each other in patterns that spoke of unity rather than isolation. The children watched in awe as the Nightflame power reshaped their understanding of what magic could accomplish. Not destruction, but creation. Not fear, but wonder. Not division, but connection. There's my Alpha Queen, Zane said softly, amber eyes holding hers with pride and love and absolute devotion. Not claiming her, not possessing her, but acknowledging the crown she'd finally chosen to wear. I won't unite the packs through fear, she declared, silver fire settling around her like a mantle of starlight. I'll do it through choice, through showing them what we could become if we stopped fighting each other and started fighting for each other. But even as victory settled around them like a benediction, shadows stirred at the edges of the grove. The lesser creatures had been defeated, the immediate threat neutralized, but something far more dangerous remained. Malaki, stripped of his power but not his knowledge, looked toward the darkness beyond the trees with haunted eyes. She was just the first, he whispered, his voice carrying the weight of terrible prophecy. The shadows have chosen their champions too. What are you talking about? Zane demanded, shadow blade still humming with protective energy. The shadow King, Malaki replied, genuine fear replacing the arrogance that had defined him for so long. Valdris Shadowborn, the first alpha, the one the original packs banished to prevent him from consuming everything. He's been using our divisions to weaken the barriers that hold him. Every pack war, every bloodline grudge, Every moment of hatred feeds his return. Cold understanding washed over Lyra like ice water. The corruption, the shadow creatures, the attempt to steal my power, all of it was preparation for his return, Malaki confirmed. And now that the Nightflame bloodline has awakened fully, now that the old powers are stirring, he has everything he needs to break free completely. As if summoned by their conversation, darkness gathered at the grove's edge with malevolent intelligence, not the mindless hunger of lesser shadows, but something ancient and calculating and utterly without mercy. A voice like grinding stone emerged from the darkness, carrying undertones that made the rescued children whimper and cling to Lyra's fire-wreathed form. The little flame thinks she has won, it said, each word dripping with contempt that had festered for centuries. How quaint, Valdris Shadowborn. The name resonated through the grove like a death knell, carrying with it the weight of every nightmare the wolf realm had tried to forget. I am patient, the voice continued, darkness coiling at the grove's edge like a living thing. I have waited centuries for the barriers to weaken, for the bloodlines to awaken, for exactly this moment when hope burns brightest. What do you want? Lyra demanded, silver fire flaring protectively around the children gathered at her feet. Everything, came the simple reply. The wolf realm, the human world, every spark of light that dares to exist. But first, you, the Nightflame heir who thinks love is stronger than inevitable darkness. The presence faded, but its promise lingered. Like poison in the air, this had been a skirmish, not a war. A test of her abilities, not the true battle. Somewhere in the ancient darkness, the Shadow King was preparing his real assault. And when he came for her, for Zane, for everything they'd fought to protect, he would bring with him powers that made tonight's shadow creatures look like children playing with candles. But as Lyra looked around the transformed grove, at the children safe in silver light, at Zane standing guard with fierce devotion, at the new growth already reaching toward hope, she felt something she'd never experienced before. Certainty, not in victory, but in purpose. Not in the outcome, but in the choice to stand against the darkness regardless of cost. The Nightflame heir had claimed her power. Now it was time to discover what that power could truly accomplish when wielded not for destruction, but for the radical act of protecting everything worth saving. The real war was coming. And this time, she would be ready. This time, she wouldn't be fighting alone. The silver flames died to gentle embers around her fingertips as the children's grateful voices faded into memory, leaving only the whisper of wind through newly grown trees and the weight of everything that had changed in a single night. She rose from ashes of rejection to become the flame that lights the darkness. But here's the question that cuts deeper than any claw, burns brighter than any silver fire would. You have chosen her side when she was broken and bleeding in the snow, when she was just another outcast stumbling through a frozen wasteland, power flickering like a dying candle, hope buried under years of being told she was too much, too dangerous, too broken to deserve love. Or would you have been one of the faces in that ceremonial hall, averting your eyes when the Alpha rejected her, one of the hunters tracking her through ice and shadow, convinced you were saving the world from a monster? Because that's the uncomfortable truth about transformation. Stories, we love them when they're over, when the broken pieces have reformed into something beautiful and powerful. But in the messy middle, when someone's still bleeding from fresh wounds and their power looks more like destruction than salvation, that's when we discover who we really are. Is she a savior bringing unity to a fractured world, or a wildfire that burns away everything familiar? The answer depends on whether you believe the old systems deserve to survive, whether you think stability built on suppression is worth preserving, whether you can look at someone society has marked as dangerous and see potential instead of threat. When the broken and rejected rise to power, do we celebrate their ascension, or do we fear what we created through our neglect? Do we cheer for Lyra Nightshade claiming her birthright, or do we worry about what happens when someone who's been treated as a weapon decides to choose her own targets? They called her too dangerous to love, but isn't that what they always say about women who burn too bright? About anyone whose very existence challenges the carefully constructed hierarchies that keep some people on top and others in the shadows. She could have become the monster they named her. Every betrayal, every rejection, every moment of cruelty gave her reason to turn that silver fire against the world that wounded her. Instead, she chose healing over vengeance, creation over destruction, protection over revenge, and Zane the Omega, who saw an alpha queen in the girl everyone else threw away, who looked at her scars and called them beautiful, who chose her not despite her power but because of her heart. The broken one who recognized that sometimes the most damaged souls carry the strongest flames. How many of us carry fires they've told us to hide? How many of us have been convinced that our intensity is intimidating, our passion is overwhelming, our refusal to shrink into acceptable shapes makes us difficult to love? Lyra's story isn't just about silver flames and ancient prophecies. It's about every person who's been told they're too much while secretly believing they're not enough. It's about the radical act of refusing to dim your light to make others comfortable. It's about finding someone who doesn't just tolerate your fire but fans it into an inferno. If this story lit something inside you, if you felt the silver fire stirring in your own chest while watching her claim her power, then you understand why tales like this matter. They remind us that being rejected by the wrong people is just redirection toward the right ones. Then join our pack at Werewolf Shifter Romance Tales. Because here, we tell stories that burn. Stories about outcasts becoming rulers, about broken souls finding wholeness, about love that doesn't require you to be smaller than you are. Hit that notification bell if you believe the rejected can rise to rule. If you think someone's darkest moments might be preparation for their brightest destiny. If you know that sometimes the world needs to burn a little before it can grow something better, leave a comment telling us, would you stand with Lyra, or would her power frighten you too? Would you have been brave enough to choose the dangerous path, or would you have taken the safe offer and walked away? When someone's strength looks like threat and their healing looks like destruction, which side of history do you want to be on? Maybe you've been the one rejected for burning too bright. Maybe you've felt like your strength was seen as a threat, your intensity labeled as instability, your refusal to accept less than you deserve branded as unreasonable expectation. Maybe you've stood in ceremonial halls of your own, watching someone choose the safer option while your heart broke in real time. Maybe you've run through frozen wastelands of the soul, wondering if anyone would ever see your scars as proof of survival rather than evidence of damage. These tales remind us that sometimes the broken ones are exactly who the world needs, that the people society discards might be the ones carrying the solutions everyone's been searching for. That love isn't about finding someone perfect, but about finding someone whose damage fits yours in ways that create strength instead of weakness. Subscribe, because everyone deserves a pack that sees their fire and says burn brighter. Because somewhere in the darkness, there are others like you carrying flames they've been told to hide, waiting for permission to let their true power show. Because the Shadow King isn't just a character in this story, he's every voice that's ever told you to be smaller, quieter, more convenient. And the only way to defeat that kind of darkness is to burn bright enough that others can find their way out of the shadows too. The real war isn't between light and darkness. It's between those who would cage the sun and those brave enough to let it rise. Which side will you choose? The answer might just change everything. They walked away from the grove hand in hand, silver flames dancing around them like protective spirits. The rescued children safely returned to families who would finally understand that not all power came wrapped in threat. The immediate danger was over. The shadow creatures were purified or destroyed. Malachi's corruption had been burned away, leaving behind a broken old wolf who would live with the consequences of his choices. The sacred space was healing, new growth already reaching toward starlight through soil that had been poisoned for decades. We did it, Zane said softly, his scarred fingers intertwined with hers as they followed a path lit by mushrooms that glowed in response to her presence. We're free. The relief in his voice was tangible, the weight of someone who'd been running his entire life finally able to stop and breathe. His amber eyes reflected the silver light dancing around them, peaceful in a way she'd never seen before, free to face whatever comes next, she replied, squeezing his hand as they crested a hill that overlooked the valley where 7-pack territories had spent centuries nursing grudges and ancient wounds. Together, the word carried promise and power in equal measure, not free from responsibility or danger, but free to choose their own battles, free to define their own worth, free to love without asking permission from people who'd never understood what they were offering. Below them, the scattered lights of pack settlements twinkled like earthbound stars, unaware that everything had changed tonight, that the old bloodlines were stirring, that the careful balance of power built on suppression and fear was already crumbling, that their savior wore the face of someone they'd spent years learning to hate. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. The pack leaders would need to accept that their world had fundamentally shifted. The awakening bloodlines would require guidance. The children who'd witnessed silver fire used for protection instead of destruction would grow up with entirely different expectations about what power could accomplish. But tonight, for just this moment, they could walk through moonlight and feel like they'd won something worth having. Then the ground beneath their feet began to tremble. Not the familiar vibration of her power responding to strong emotion, but something else entirely. Something that came from deep beneath the earth, as if ancient foundations were shifting in response to forces that predated the current age by millennia. The night sky, clear just moments before, began to fill with clouds that moved against the wind. Thick, roiling darkness that blocked out stars with unnatural precision, as if something was deliberately drawing a curtain across the heavens. That's not natural weather, Zane observed, his hand moving instinctively to where the shadow blade rested against his hip. Around them, the forest went silent with the kind of absolute quiet that preceded earthquakes or avalanches. Even the nocturnal hunters' owls, bats, the small predators that should have been active at this hour simply vanished, leaving behind an emptiness that felt like held breath. Her silver flames flickered and dimmed without warning, as if something vast and hungry was drawing away their light. The sensation was wrong on a cellular level, like trying to breathe underwater or speak with no vocal cords. "Something's coming," she whispered, power surging as she fought against whatever force was dampening her abilities. "Something that makes the shadow creatures look like children playing with candles." The voice, when it came, seemed to emerge from the darkness itself rather than any specific location. Deep, resonant, carrying undertones that made her bones ache and her inner wolf whimper in primordial recognition. "The little flame thinks she has won." Each word hit the air like a physical blow, reverberating through dimensions that normal senses couldn't perceive. This wasn't the desperate hunger of lesser shadows or the calculated manipulation of corrupted pack leaders. This was something that had existed before wolves learned to shift, before the first packs formed, before light and darkness were separated into opposing forces. She is not the only one who has awakened. Understanding crashed over her like ice water. The Nightflame bloodline stirring hadn't just awakened her own abilities, it had sent ripples through the magical substrate that bound all wolf kind together. Other dormant powers, other banished bloodlines, other ancient forces that had been sleeping for centuries, not all of them friendly. "I am Valdris Shadowborn, the first Alpha, the one they tried to erase from history." The voice carried the weight of millennia. Patient and implacable and absolutely without mercy. "And I have been gathering my own descendants." The darkness at the edge of her vision began to coalesce into shapes that defied easy description. Not the mindless hunger of shadow creatures, but ancient wolves whose power had been twisted by centuries of exile and rage. Eyes like burning coals opened in the blackness, dozens of them, each pair representing a bloodline that had been banished. A power that had been forbidden, a force that had been waiting for exactly this moment to return. "If the Nightflame bloodline stirs," the voice continued with something that might have been amusement, "then so do we all. Balance must be maintained, little flame. For every force of creation, there must be an equal measure of destruction." Her silver fire blazed brighter in response to the threat, but she could feel the scope of what they were facing. Not a single enemy, however powerful, but an entire ecosystem of ancient forces that had been contained by the same barriers that had hidden her own heritage. The prophecy wasn't about uniting the current packs, Zane said quietly, his voice carrying the dawning realization of someone who'd just understood the true scope of their situation. It was about preparing for the war that's been coming since the first bloodlines were banished. 7 blood moons until the barriers fall completely, Valdris's mental voice whispered directly into their consciousness. 7 cycles of power building, ancient bonds weakening, old grudges demanding settlement. The Shadow Realm has been patient, little flame. We can afford to be patient a little longer. But patience doesn't mean inaction. The red eyes in the darkness began to move, circling them with predatory intelligence. Not attacking, not yet, but making their presence known. Establishing that the rules had changed, that the game Lyra thought she'd won was actually just the opening move in something far more complex. Let them come, she said, silver flame erupting around her like a crown of starfire. The frightened girl who'd run through frozen wastelands was gone, replaced by someone who understood her own worth and refused to apologize for taking up space in a world that had never wanted her. I know who I am now, and I will not hide my fire again. The declaration rang through the darkness like a challenge and a promise. Whatever ancient powers were stirring, whatever banished bloodlines were preparing to reclaim their place in the world, they would find the Nightflame heir ready to meet them, not as a victim or a sacrifice or a convenient weapon to be wielded by others, but as exactly what she'd always been meant to become, a force of nature that burned bright enough to light the way through any darkness. The red eyes faded back into shadow, but their promise lingered like smoke in the air. This had been reconnaissance, not assault. A reminder that victory was temporary and war was eternal. But as Lyra stood with silver fire dancing around her and Zane's unwavering loyalty at her side, she felt something she'd never experienced before: anticipation. Not fear of what was coming, but excitement about who she would become in the crucible of whatever trials awaited. The broken girl who'd been rejected for being too dangerous was dead. In her place stood someone who embraced danger as a tool for protecting everything worth saving. Let the ancient powers rise. Let the banished bloodlines return. Let the Shadow King himself emerge from whatever hell had contained him for centuries. She was Lyra Nightshade, heir of Luna's flame, and she was finally ready to burn bright enough to reshape the world. But that is a tale for another night. Will Lyra's flame be enough when the first Alpha rises? When the ancient bloodlines clash in battles that will determine the future of all wolfkind? When love and fire face off against hatred that has festered for millennia? Subscribe to find out if the bond between a broken Omega and a dangerous heir can survive the coming storm. Because this story is just the beginning, the first spark in a conflagration that will either purify the wolf realm or consume it entirely. And tell us in the comments, what power do you think is awakening next? What ancient bloodline has been hiding in plain sight, waiting for this moment to reveal itself? What force could possibly stand against silver fire backed by absolute devotion? The darkness is stirring, the old powers are rising, and somewhere in the shadows, other love stories are beginning, tales of forbidden bloodlines and impossible bonds, of outcasts finding their true strength and discovering that sometimes the most dangerous magic is the kind that heals instead of destroys. The war for the soul of the wolf realm has begun. Choose your side carefully. The fire is spreading.